My name is Keith James, and I worked for Derek Evans and then with him as his partner for over 50 years.
Can you tell us how you came to be working for Derek and can you give us dates as well and where you worked with him?
It was 1962. I was at the high school for boys in Hereford, and art teacher Harold Coates said to me, "I understand a chap called Derek Evans wants an assistant. Why don't you go along for an interview?" And one Saturday morning I climbed those 79 steps right to the top of the studio in Broad Street, and there was Derek in his own little private office, and I just talked to him for about 2 hours. I can't remember it being a formal interview at all, but then it was never Derek's way to be formal. A few days later I got a letter saying, "Would you like to take the job?" Well, of course I jumped at it because it was 1 in a million, the job was 1 in a million.
Can you tell us a little bit about his reputation for nurturing talent, including yours and other people who worked with him?
I didn't really know much about him at the time. I had seen him on the Hereford racecourse when there was a competition between the American Free Forces and the SAS boys at parachute jumping. And I knew of him by reputation through my father, who was a keen amateur photographer. But apart from that, I knew very little about the business.
Can you describe the studio? Because people smoked, people used to drop in. It was a microcosm, apparently. Can you just paint that picture for us a little bit?
Yes, it was a long climb to the top of the stairs, and then under the eaves of the building, we had a number of rooms. There was a studio room, a dark room, and the office itself. Of course, this is 1962, and everybody smoked. Everybody in the studio smoked, and we would all smoke probably 20 cigarettes a day. So with at least 3 people in the studio, you can imagine there were 60 cigarettes a day going through that studio. And it did mean that once a year in the spring, we would have to wash the nicotine off the ceiling of the office. And of course, it was my duty as a newcomer to the studio to empty the ashtrays.
So you were new to the studio, and you were thrown in at the deep end. Did Derek have a habit of doing that? Can you maybe illustrate that through the Oxford game?
Well, absolutely. Derek had a way of putting you in the deep end. You were never actually taught anything or shown anything, but you learnt by example, and you learnt by following his working practices. But of course, he did overreach it at one point, because I'd only been with them a few months, and there was an Oxford United football match which needed covering one winter's evening. And Derek was ill. And he said to me, "You'll have to go." And I protested, "Derek, look, I know nothing about football. It would be hopeless. You know, can we not cancel it?" No, you have to go. So I went to Oxford United, and I was sitting I was positioned in the midway point, I think, of the pitch. Couldn't see either goal properly because it was so foggy. And there were 8 goals scored, and I missed every one of them. Not exactly the best way of starting a career filming sport, but of course it was a lesson for the studio. I don't think they ever sent me to film a football match again.
Good time. That's lovely. That. Very good.
Were you there, Keith, for the 72 match, Hereford versus Newcastle?
Oh yes, we were. Well, everybody was there. I mean, in those days, we had to make regular calls to Fleet Street, where the national newspapers were. And we would do it by transfer charge calls through the local telephone exchange. And I can remember, I think I rang the Daily Express or something, and the fellow on the other end said, "Oh, you play football down in Hereford, don't you?" And of course, everybody in Britain was talking about this one great big game and this one wonderful goal which was scored by Ron Radford.
Yeah, what were you actually doing that day? What else?
Well, on the day of the match, of course, which you're referring to this famous muddy football match for against Newcastle, I was sent along there as an extra string. I mean to say, this was an important football game. And if you had a spare photographer, even if he was known to be a dunce at photographing football, he was sent there. And so I was sitting on the edge of the Goalmouth with Derek and a number of other photographers. And of course, what has really stymied, I think, the Newcastle players were this heavy snow and rain that we had. And of course, it was so muddy they couldn't drag the ball about. And our folks were used to it. But all of a sudden, of course, this one great big shot rocketed across the goal mouth, and there we are. It's one of the most celebrated goals ever.
What was it like being a young man, young photographer at this studio in Hereford? Can you paint the scene? Don't be shy.
You could say I was going to work, but it was never, ever work. I enjoyed it too much. It just could never be thought of work, and every day was something different. The thing to remember, of course, is that independent television was in its infancy in these days, and we were working for ATV, which is later Central Television, and TWW, later HTV. So the studio phone would ring probably 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and we would all flee like mice from a sinking ship and run off to do various film assignments. The majority of the work then started to become film. Terribly exciting times, terribly exciting. And we had an enormous range of contacts too, who would ring in and say, there's a fire somewhere, or did you know such and such an event was taking place? So we travelled all over mid Wales and parts of Shropshire and Herefordshire, because that was the patch of ground allocated to us by independent television.
But there's this, one of Derek's proteges, he was, with a couple of other photographers, was described as the young meteors. I'm just trying to get a sense of that being a young man.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Did you walk around with town with a certain swagger?
Oh no, not at all, not at all. No, we didn't have time to walk around town. We were just so busy. Day after day after day, we would film for independent television. And of course, at weekend, there was a lot of sports to do. Derek, of course, did the football. But I did an awful lot with rowing. Heads of the Rivers Race, I think was one was called. And I did a lot of motorcycle scrambling. And there were other sporting events which had to be covered. So we were probably more busy at weekends than we were in the weekdays.
So can we just talk a little bit about the equipment you used? Quite crude, heavy then, but images that came out of that studio were absolutely stunning. Can you tell us a bit about that? What you were using?
It's quite extraordinary looking back to see the change that, of course, there's been in photography, and it's like the canals and the railways, isn't it? It's a stunning sort of moment in time. I well remember a man at a laboratory in Kidderminster once saying to me, when digital systems came in, that he was still doing traditional work, but last week it was almost as if a switch had been thrown and everybody was going digital. And you must look back on those periods and remember that all photographic systems in those days were made mechanically. It was the watchmaker, the clockmaker, the skilled lathe maker who actually assembled cameras, because cameras were entirely mechanical. When it came to film, for instance, we did have an electric Arriflex cine camera, but I principally used clockwork, Payard Bolex 16mm cameras. Now, the Payard Bolex would only run for about 22 seconds on a single wind. So you had to be careful and you had to measure when you actually pressed the button and started the camera running. The Arriflex, of course, would run continuously, but there again you had to be careful that your lead acid battery actually went down in value as you used it, and if you didn't correct it, then people in your images would look like Charlie Chaplin suddenly racing along. Very skilled stuff, and everything had to be done by instinct, intuition, and experience. No white balance, no automatic white balance, no automatic focus, nothing like that at all. Tough times.
Okay, tell us about what you're holding there, please.
Well, there you go. This is the beast. This is the 16mm Arriflex camera that we used. And as you can see, I'm struggling at my age now to hold the damn thing steady, and it really was a problem. This is very, very weighty indeed. It's an entirely metal construction. The piece on the top with number 2 here is the 400-foot magazine. Normally from news work, you wouldn't have this attached to the camera. The film would be contained inside here, and there would be a 100-foot spool. It would last 2.5 minutes. Now, that was very important to realise, that you only had this 2.5 minutes if you were, for instance, filming just a short snatch for news of a football match, because you had to process later 100-foot of film. Consequently, they didn't expect you to use 2, 3 or 4 spools. And a good experienced operator like Derek would anticipate when a goal was going to be scored and squirt off perhaps 20, 30 seconds of film. However, sometimes you did have this 400-foot magazine on the top, which gives you 10 minutes footage. But the other thing with it is, it has a 3-lens turret, and of course, there is no way in which you can have automatic iris on this or automatic focusing. So it has to be done with this one hand, and you can actually pull focus, as they say, as you move along. The other difficulty was, of course, if you happened to be filming somebody outside and the sun came out or the sun went in, then the exposure would change, and you would have to adjust that by counting the clicks on the front of the lens here without taking your eye from the eyepiece, because you still had to see what was going on. So it was a difficult camera to use, it was a heavy camera to use, and today I don't think people realise just how easy it is for them all. Yes, of course, I'm old enough to have started working with black and white film. And in fact, when I started, taking a picture in black and white in the middle of winter was quite a skill. And it didn't always come out as easily as you thought. Then, of course, along came colour. And working on colour negatives was quite difficult at first, but of course, everything then had to go to a laboratory to be processed. It meant that you couldn't spend hours in the darkroom adjusting pictures exactly as you would like them. That was the beauty of the black and white. You could do it precisely as you liked. All of a sudden, things went to a laboratory. And that was okay. It slowly came in. It was more influential, I think, in the commercial world. But of course, there came a point where television moved to colour. And our studio was better equipped than most to deal with it. It was a lot of problem. You were shooting colour transparency material. To shoot colour transparency material, you had to be 80 to 100% accurate on your exposure every time. Otherwise, it was washed out or it was too dark to see. Derek, of course, had done some colour transparencies work on the Queen's coronation, and way back in 1953. And he'd kept working with colour transparency, which was the most difficult medium of all to use. I had started doing colour transparencies for commercial work, so I was adept at it. And I remember the first article I was sent to film in colour for HTV was a retired naval commander who grew orchids. And of course, that was a very colourful thing. But I'd also then been using what was called a spot meter with a neutral grey density card. And you could then measure the light on the neutral grey density card and adjust your exposure accordingly, so I could work accurately. And the first piece of film of this orchid was sent down to the studio, and it said, hang on everybody, this is the way to work. Look at the colour here. This is what we want every time. But of course, you didn't have static orchids every time. There were occasions when you had to work on the hoof, you had to run, the light was coming in and out, you were going in and out of houses and all the rest of it, and the exposure was all over the place. Very difficult, but we managed.
And so the transition from photography to film. Am I right in thinking that Derek had gone to a show in Cologne to look at equipment? And you also talked about the ratio. You know, at one point it was 60% film.
Yes.
So if we could just talk.
No, it was. There were a number of rewards that Derek gave to the staff. He was the chairman of the photojournalism group at the Royal Photographic Society, and once a month would go to London to chair the evening meeting. And if we'd had a particularly buoyant month and we'd sold well and we did good pictures and all the rest of it, one of us would be taken to London for an outing. And we would always go down into Au Jardin de Gourmet, which was his favourite restaurant in London, and we would have a slap-out meal there. And we were introduced to things like frog's legs, les grenouilles, as Derek called them. And we had escargots, snails. You can imagine what it was like for young Herefordshire boys to suddenly go to a posh restaurant in London and have some snails. Knowing in the corner, of course, would be the Bolting brothers, the famous film producers. So that was one reward. But then the rewards did get a little bit better, and all of a sudden Derek decided that we should go to the International Film Fair at Cologne, a photo fair as it was called. And so we would drive over to Cologne and we would have 2 or 3 days there, and we would look at the new developments which were coming on in photography. And of course it was the showcase, and it was the showcase of the new video systems coming in. Having exhausted ourselves there for 2 or 3 days, we would go down to the wine festivals down the Rhine, and we would have a glorious booze up, and we would be there singing in the streets at night. Great stuff.
Derek adopts this new technology, filming. What was the effect of that on the studio? And the photographers there, because it's a different discipline, isn't it? Is it? I mean...
No, I find it particularly moving from film to video in the television industry actually came up on a lot of resistance. I can remember most of the cameramen saying, well, yes, of course, every time it rains, these cameras stop working. There was an enormous amount of resistance. But once it was accepted, you had to go with it. Derek moved easily into it. Easily and seamlessly into it. He had no trouble with it at all, in fact welcomed it. But then Derek had on a number of other occasions come back from London with a new piece of kit, or over at Cologne we'd seen a new piece of kit and he said, we'll have one of those, which we did.
So he never sat on his laurels really, he was always looking forward and moving forward.
Oh, Derek was, yes. Oh yes, Derek was, yes. I think towards the end of his life, though, I think he did resent perhaps so much of the change. And I think the change that he resented really was the attitude of people to the work that was being done. It was becoming more and more difficult to have fun with what you were doing. And inevitably with Derek, wherever you went, there was always a sense of fun, unless, of course, it was the tragedy of Aberfan, which actually was quite shocking.
Do you remember that time?
I remember the Aberfan episode quite clearly. Derek went down there for 2 or 3 days. I remember him telling me too that there was a lot of hostility then to the photographers, because the one thing that happened, I think the Paris Match photographers, the French photographers, had tried to get into a little chapel where the children's coffins were all lined up. And obviously that had caused a great deal of upset down there. And so there was a lot of hostility towards the photographers, but none to Derek, strangely enough. And I think perhaps it's a thing with Welsh people, they sense their own. Derek was the son of a Welsh miner, and perhaps it was that insulated him from their hostility.
So one of your quotes, Keith, is Derek had all the cunning and all the skills and all the contacts to know what was going on in a particular patch.
Oh.
How important was that, all those things within that studio?
Derek loved people. He liked people. Derek was miserable if he was in the middle of a field with nobody around him. I mean to say, Derek always wanted people around him, and he always impressed people, I think, and people liked Derek, and so they consequently became part of a huge chain of people who would ring him up and say, did you know so-and-so was going on? Or did you know such and such an event? And this was how the studio operated. This was why the studio was successful in television.
What was your contribution to the studio? What's your legacy?
I like to think I was technically a sound photographer at all levels, from the early black and white stuff right the way through the introduction of colour, particularly with the colour transparencies. And I was probably more able, no, I don't think, perhaps that's not right, I'm probably more willing to properly construct a little bit of film for television than Derek was. Derek would see an event and he'd just go bang at it, whereas I would be thinking of the left and the right and all the rest of it. Then, of course, I went on to do all the studio commercial work. And that blossomed in the 80s and became probably the principal source of income for the studio.
Can you just tell us a little bit about your work and the skill, the sheer skill that was involved?
It was over a period of time that I developed a number of techniques for the studio. Perhaps some of the most difficult to describe are the multiple exposure pictures that I did, where I would combine two images on the same piece of film. And in the studio I was working with Hasselblads, and one end of the studio I would put one particular set, and on the other I would put another set. Then I would take a picture on the first, and without moving the film forward, take it over to the second, and make another exposure on top of it. And that meant that I had pictures, for instance, which showed things like starburst filters and that on industrial stuff. It was great fun to do, great fun. And it was all done on colour transparencies.
But you garnered quite a reputation, didn't you, for your studio and commercial work?
Yes, I was very lucky. And of course the other thing that helped enormously was I did an awful lot for the drinks industry, because Bulmers at those times, you see, they had other divisions. They had a soft drinks division which dealt with Perrier, Volvic, Contarex and other important brands of water, and Orangina. Then they had a wines and spirits division which would have included things like Paul Roger Champagne, VAT 69 whiskey, Glenmorangie, Taboo and Mirage, and I worked on all those brands. And then again, as people from Bulmers moved to other sections of the drinks industry, I continued working for them.
Your clients were not just Herefordshire, all over the country, so it was a good revenue.
Very lucrative, wasn't it?
For the studio.
Yes, of course, by this time, there were other people who actually sort of almost bolted onto the studio with contacts. There were some very good local designers, for instance, Joe Newton-Seeley and Hayden Dixon-Ross, and of course Jenny Taylor. They would all in turn have clients who all needed photographic work, and they would bring the photographic work to me. I'm looking now, for instance, at a series of pictures here which I took for a company which did industrial equipment. And it's reminded me, this is 1993, that even in 1993, although I was the author of the work, under the copyright rules in those days, it was still published under the owner's name. So it was credited with Derek Evans, although Derek actually didn't take any pictures at all. And then there's this one, which was always a source of enormous fun to us, actually. I used to work for Marigold Gloves, their industrial division, and that took us to all sorts of places. Actually, that actually is a studio picture, but nevertheless we went into some very grubby factories to show where these gloves were used. But it was very lucrative work, and I literally had queues of work, box loads from the back door right through to the studio door. There'd be all sorts of things, from bottles of drink, electronics, everything to be photographed.
Derek ever have anything to do with that side of the studio work?
No, Derek didn't have anything to do with that side of the work. He would freely admit he didn't have the patience for it. And of course he wasn't talking to a person. You know, a bottle of cider on a bench had no interest for Derek whatsoever. He just liked to see the queue of work though going through the door.
So you developed that side of the studio work?
Oh yes, that was the forte, yes. And it's strange actually when you think, looking back over the 50 years of the studio, the first section of it, as I remember, was based entirely upon newspaper work and the fledgling television work. But then in the 60s, 70s and through into just the start of the 80s, the main breadwinner for the studio was the television work. Mid-80s onwards, right through the 90s, it would have been the commercial work that I was doing. The studio changed.
Okay, Keith, so just going back a bit in the earlier days, 60s and 70s, when I read that the the studio team would go through all the newspapers looking for a story. Can you tell us about that?
Any freelance office in those days relied upon information. Where would the information come from? Principally the chain of contacts. You would actually listen out for a passing fire engine, and if the fire engine had its bell ringing, you would ring the controller and say, "Where's the fire?" Or otherwise you would scour the local newspapers and the regional newspapers and see if there were stories you could adapt. And if you could adapt them, then you would create your own story. Having created a story and working for the newspapers, of course, you were not certain that it would be published. So you would ring a picture editor and say, "I've got such and such a story. Would you like us to do some pictures?" And the picture editor would say, "Yeah, I like that story." And he would order it, in which case you would definitely get paid. Or he'd say, "Well, I'm not so certain about that. Send us a picture on the spec. If we use it, we will pay you. If we don't use it, we don't get paid." And there were occasions, of course, when an editor would say, "Sorry, just don't like that story."
I think my impression of Derek was he always had his eye on the money as well.
Oh, of course, yes, it was a commercial studio. It had to pay its way. If we went working in mid-Wales, filming in particular, there was a fellow called Gwilym Owen who used to come with me. He was a researcher. And if we went to mid-Wales working for HTV or TWW as it was then, we used to have a policy that we wouldn't come back to the studio unless we had an idea for another story. And in Gwilym's case, it invariably meant calling at a nearby pub and talking to people. But of course, pubs are a great exchange place for gossip. And it inevitably worked. It inevitably worked.
What about the hardy perennials then, the diary stories?
At the end of every year, you would sit at the desk and you would go back through the previous year's work, and you would know there are certain items that would come up again the following year and the year and the year and the year. And they were things like ploughing competitions. There was a daffodil competition, a bulb competition at the Shire for school children, I remember, and a few other things. They would always render good pictures, and you would go along there, and if you got a good picture, then of course you could sell it. Sometimes you didn't have an immediate sale for the pictures, but nevertheless you would still take the pictures and send them to an agency in London. Now we use Camera Press, which is a very good agency run by a Hungarian chap called Tom Blau. And so we would have a library of pictures in London with Camera Press. And then you would get monthly sales from them. You had 50% of world sales, and it would be quite startling to find out where some of the sales came from. An amusing incident came out of a very disappointing time for us. We were booked to do the production stills at HTV at Bristol of the visit of the Beatles. We were all wound up to go down there, and at the last minute it was cancelled. So there we were at the studio, all glum faces. We were all going to see the Beatles. It wasn't going to happen. Not only was it not going to happen, but we weren't going to have a day's work. And a visitor came to the studio and promptly said, "Give me a cup of tea and let's see what we can sort," and then started to dial all the local telephone exchange, Bulmers, Wigan, Painter Brothers, AEI, that's Smart and Brown and all the rest of it, and said, "The Beatles are coming to the Green Dragon for lunch." And soon the street outside filled with people, absolutely filled with people. And then the gentleman concerned, whose occupation I will not describe, went down to direct the traffic round all the people. That evening, it was on Central, or ATV as it was that evening, saying there'd been a hoax in Hereford, that the Beatles were due to go to the Green Dragon Hotel, and coincidentally, there'd been a meeting of local environmental pest control officers.
Derek's photographs of children in the hop fields, the Wessington Deaf School, are really, really quite special. What do you think what do you think that was? What do you think his skill was? Was it?
Well, that was a thing we all watched, and we all learnt from, to be honest, to be how to sort of seamlessly become part of what was going on there without intruding at all, not being a presence there. And so people were at ease. And Derek always had this one great virtue, that when you were photographing the main event in front of you, if you looked over your shoulder, inevitably the better picture was the reaction on the face of somebody behind you. And this is where he got some of these golden pictures. I think some of the hop picking pictures with the children in particular, they're wonderful pictures. But then he was able to do it. He would just melt into the background and become part of the scene. He was one of the people there. He wasn't any threat to them or anything.
Keith, tell us about your favourite Derek Evans portraits.
I think it's extraordinary that when you look back at the variety of items that the studio covered, for instance, there was an enormous file of royalty, which went to the Camera Press Agency. And there were other personalities that we photographed, but yet at the back of it all, the most memorable studies, I think, are ordinary people in ordinary situations. Derek had enormous humanity. He had a great regard for the underdog mind, and I mean to say he would be very, very, very vociferous in his defence of some people and what they did. And I've got a few pictures here actually, which two or three, which I think are perhaps indicative of the sort of thing that he did. This one in particular, which is a miner, and it was part of a number of pictures taken for HTV/TWW when they were filming the closure of one of the last mines in Wales. And I think it's a tremendous picture. It says a lot, I think, again, about the Welsh character. Here's this fellow, he's just come up from a shift, his mine's closing, his face is covered in grime, he's got a wonderful strong set of teeth, because I expect this is the fellow you'd want with you if you were ever in a brawl or something. He'd be a tough guy. But nevertheless, he's got a smile in his eyes and he's looking forward to better things, isn't he? And I think it's a great picture, a memorable picture, and I'm very pleased that's a picture that I've kept for myself. There's another one here, but this is a younger man, of course. He's a miner again, but perhaps he's looking out of the picture. He knows the mine is closed. Perhaps he's looking forward to greater things. And it's funny, really, how the Welsh items figure so large. And of all the pictures that were ever taken at the studio, I think this is the most memorable picture of the lot. And it was taken by Jennifer Delaney, who was Derek's first assistant. She took it apparently early one morning, seeing these children scrabbling around for some coal on a coal heap somewhere. And I love the fact that the little chap, he's got his trousers tied up with string, he's got his little daps on, and how he's offended or what he said to the little girl in the background, I just don't know, but she's just wandering away. I do know that it was joked many times, perhaps this guy ended up as the mayor of Merthyr Tydfil. And Jennifer made efforts 30 years later to trace them, but no trace of them. Gorgeous picture. Perfect timing, incidentally. This is the Cartier-Bresson stuff, isn't it? This is where you have the decisive moment, where, you know, the child is walking away. If she'd have gone any farther, she'd have been in a frame too soon. She probably wouldn't have been walking in the same stance. So that's the thing. That's the Derek Evans style of teaching.
I can't remember the name of the pub now. What's the name of that pub?
Golden Fleece.
The Golden Fleece. So were you all members of the NUJ? And
Are we running?
Yep.
And who was there, you know, why you were there, when you were there?
We were all members of the National Union of Journalists, and the chapel meeting once a month took place at the Golden Fleece, the pub opposite the town hall in Hereford. And it was a very well attended chapel, mind there. There would have been 20, 25 journalists at least, and we would sit in the back room there with a pint of beer talking about things. And one evening there, suddenly the door came open and a bus conductor put his head through the door and he said, I don't know why you're all sitting here, he said. They've closed the road outside. There's been a murder down the road. So we did leave our pints, I must say, but we all trooped in a file all the way down St. Owen Street, and sure enough, Dr. Parker had been murdered. And just as this gang of journalists arrived, Chief Inspector Westwood, I think his name, arrived to say, "How the hell did you get here before me?" And the explanation was one bus conductor who found time for a pint of beer because they couldn't move his bus.
We just want to talk about the studios and Derek's. It wasn't just a parochial studio, it had an international profile, didn't it? And
It did.
a series of awards. I wonder if we could talk about that.
That came about because, of course, Derek's early work. Derek recognised the importance of being seen at major exhibitions and getting awards. And he went on holiday in Belgium, of course. He'd taken a series of pictures there of street traders and all the rest of it, and entered competitions with them, and they were used by the Belgian press. They were used particularly in one large photographic magazine, a continental photographic magazine. And it drew Derek to the attention of the film manufacturer Gavart, who were in Belgium. And then Gavart would send new films, batches of films, to Derek for him to take pictures with, and hopefully get publications in things like the Amateur Photographer and the rest of it, saying, "I've used Gavapan 33 and all the rest of it." So that was the first dimension. And then, of course, a lot of the work that we were doing, as I said, went to Australia and all the rest of it. And we were working for ITN. And at one point, we were even commissioned to do a short film by Walt Disney. And what had happened was they were relaunching Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and they were literally sending round some characters around shopping centres, and we had to film the public reaction to it. And we were flown in some rickety old aircraft, I remember, from Cardiff to Bristol, but it was great fun, great fun.
So, Derek's work is in the archive in Antwerp, isn't it?
Correct.
And what other sorts of awards were there?
Well, there were a lot of gold medal winning individual pictures that he had, and of course a whole host of publications in specialist magazines.
So I wonder if were you involved with the jazz scene in the 60s? Keith?
No.
Too young.
No, Derek was.
Yeah.
Derek was a passionate fan of jazz, and there are some tremendous early pictures of Count Basie and all the rest of it. The one thing I did do with Derek was Duke Ellington came to Coventry Cathedral in about 1970, 72, 73, and we went there to photograph the concert that he was giving, or the rehearsal for the concert. And I took a series of pictures, and I remember I sent them to Amateur Photographer, and I had 3 pages published of these pictures of Duke Ellington. More rewarding than that was, when we got to Cologne, to the International Photo Festival, my pictures were in the festival edition, and they were alongside a fellow by the name of Waterman, if I remember right correctly, and he was one of the first photographers doing air-to-air pictures of skydivers. It was quite a celebration. I was very pleased with that.
Was Derek pleased for you?
He never said. He never said. Never said. And I was paid well, I remember. I was paid £150 a page. So it was £450 for 3 pages of work. And that didn't go to the studio, incidentally. I kept that money myself.
So in the 60s, I mean, this is before the age of, cameras with phones and, disposable cameras. So there would have been a number of photographic studios around the city. Was there lots of competition? I mean, we've heard things like, somebody would say, "Oh, Derek's got a Mercedes," somebody else would have a Jag, lots of competition. What was that like?
There was competition, of course, but we were principally outside of it because most of the competition would be amongst the wedding and the portrait photographers, and which we never touched. We didn't do photograph weddings, we didn't do portraits. But there was one memorable piece of competition I remember. There was a fellow by the name of Beaver who was a caterer, did a lot of catering for the Three Counties Showground, and he had a cafe cum restaurant in Maylord Street where the new shopping centre is, called the Silver Grill. And there was an accident at Pontrylas and the poor man was killed. And I can remember with Rick Calder, we were in a car going down to Pontrias to photograph this thing. And I can remember there was a green van with Barry Griffiths in it from the Hereford Times, and there was another one from the Hereford Evening News, and the three of us were racing down to Pontrias to get there first. So that was the competition. And there was competition for stories, of course.
Be good also to hear about who were the other photographic studios in town.
Well, I'll just tell you one more thing of a source of a story. A story appeared in the Hereford Evening News of a young lady in Ross who had gone to a Conservative Party outdoor garden party, and she'd bared her breasts. And on her breast she had Vote Labour, and on her back she had something like Labour has nothing to hide. And it was published in the paper as an anonymous story. But Neil Graham, who was the Western Daily reporter, said, come on, he said, we've got to go and find this girl. He said, I want to go and do a story. Well, how do you find a girl in Ross who's done this? So Neil, being a very experienced journalist, said, well, we'll just ask everybody. And he and I, we walked around Ross for about an hour and a half. Do you know the girl? 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 When all of a sudden this fellow said, oh yeah, he said, it was Sandy down in the corner. She lives just so-and-so. So as we went to the house, there was suddenly a summer thunderstorm and the whole of Ross flooded. And there we were now with our shoes off, but knee deep in water to get to this house. But we got to the house and knocked on the door. And the young girl, Sandy, said, yeah, she said, it was me, she said, and all the rest of it. And could we do a story and could we photograph her, which we did. But that was the way of finding the girl. Just ask people in a small town.
We could just do that, talk about the volume of photographic studios and photographers in Hereford.
Well, of course, one of the first things that I began to realise, this is 1963, is just how many photographers there were in the town. Just up the road in Broad Street, of course, was Richard Hammond's. And then round the corner was Bustin's. In Hightown was Foster and Skeffington. There was Reg Rumsey down Church Street, and Vivian's in Church Street, which was, of course, run entirely by ladies. I'll tell you a story about Vivian's, if I may. We're again going back now to probably the early 1970s. And Vivian's studio in Church Street was entirely staffed by ladies. And they had a contract with RAF Credden Hill to photograph the passing out parade on each new squadron. And all of a sudden, the proprietor, Thelma Holland, then came to Derek one day and she said, Derek, I really don't know what to do. She said, one of the other photographers has suggested that on this all-male parade ground, they've got a female photographer and that shouldn't be allowed. And Derek, of course, as I said before, Derek was one for always sticking up for the underdog. Said, well, don't worry, I'll send one of my chaps along on the parade ground for you. So what we used to do was we would go up to RAF Credden Hill once a month. Thelma Holland would stand there. We would take a Rolleiflex with a roll of film in it. We would walk out onto the parade ground. We would take pictures of the inspecting officer, and then we would hand her the roll of film, and we would go back to the studio. It wouldn't take us long, and Derek would charge her £5 to do that. But it defended her contract, and she kept her contract until RAF Credden Hill closed.
That was very kind and generous of him.
No, that's... Derek didn't like underhand methods, didn't like that at all, It was just not a way to behave professionally.
Tell us about his politics. What do you know about his politics?
I know a lot about his politics. Derek was a staunch Liberal and, of course, was a supporter of Frank Owen from the 1950s, who stood here as for the general election. He was then the publicity agent for Robin Day, later Sir Robin Day, when he stood for the parliamentary seat of South Hereford here. And, of course, he was a committed Liberal. And at one point, the Liberal Party in Hereford were the majority on the city council here. And apart from Derek as a city councillor, he also went to the West Midlands Sports Council, sorry, and together with the officers of Herefordshire Council, they brought the money to Hereford to build the swimming baths on the King George's playing field. And typical of Derek, when it came time for the first sod to be cut there, rather than do it himself or get some member of the hierarchy, he got the youngest member of Hereford Swimming Club to cut the first sod. And I think that's commemorated on a plaque there somewhere to this day. And then, of course, he was on the council for a number of years with a number of very highly regarded local Liberals.
What was the greatest lesson you learned from Derek?
God, that's a difficult question. I don't know, you learnt many things from Derek, many things. I suppose really and truly the greatest lesson from Derek was that if you were fortunate enough to work in a studio like his and fortunate enough to work with a man like Derek, work could be fun, really fun. It could be great fun.
What was the reputation of the studio in its heyday?
I think it always had a fine reputation. There were very, very few occasions where perhaps things didn't go well. I can't ever remember a situation in which we didn't supply the customer, the newspaper or the television with what it needed. But then that also rubbed off, incidentally, that reliability rubbed off with other people who worked for Derek and then left, like Mike Charity in Cheltenham. I mean to say, I remember mentioning Mike to a Central Television producer one day, and he said, "Oh, Mike." "Oh, yeah," he said, "Mike." He said, "You could always rely on Mike." Reliability, that was the thing.
But there's something about Derek, I mean, he could mix with lords and ladies and coal miners.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Derek was at ease with most people. Yes, he really was. Derek was never shy either.
Just what is the point, do you think, in Derek's archive? What, as opposed to, say, an archive of ancient manuscripts. This is a photograph.
Well, I think probably of all industries these days, the photographic industry has changed more radically than any other I can think of. And if you look back at Derek's work, this was an entirely different world. They say there's a saying, isn't there? The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, and we did do things differently there. And it's been a long journey, to be honest, in some respects, to get from where we are today to where we were some years ago. And really and truly, if you want to know how far you've gone, I suppose you have to know the starting point. And when that switch was thrown, as that man described in Kidderminster, to say, we're going digital now, that was the starting point. And the end, perhaps, of the old systems.
I'd just be interested to know what's the value of looking at these photographs. It's not just about pure nostalgia, is it? I mean, do you think, I just want to counter that thing that it's all about nostalgia, really. What would you say about that, Keith, really?
I think the other thing that brought it home to me recently, I'm rereading some books about politics in the 1960s, and a book in particular by Ludovic Kennedy, which he published in 1979. And if you listen to the words that are written there, and some of the way in which he, an accomplished journalist, expressed himself, you realise just how far society has gone since 1979 in its attitude, social attitudes in particular. And of course, Derek's pictures actually show people in an entirely different context, working. They're in a society in an entirely different way.
Because Russell Roberts described his work as a valuable social and cultural asset.
Yes, yes, I think that's true. The one thing that I always think, looking back on the pictures of Derek, though, is most of the people looked pretty cheerful. Everybody was having fun. I don't think they were under the pressure that the people seem to be today.